The problem had already happened by the time anyone understood it was a problem, which is usually how things start for us. Not with noise, but with a small decision nobody marks down, like letting a stranger sit too close or letting a question pass without asking who told him to ask it. And the first sign was when the kid in the torn gray hoodie leaned near Rafe's shoulder and said under his breath, "He's wearing a wire." And Rafe didn't argue or panic or even look surprised. He just lifted his glass, stared at it like it had said something rude to him, and poured the drink slowly onto the floorboards. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Nobody reacted to that sentence because nobody heard it as strange. Maybe because strange things slip by when your mind is already busy measuring danger. And the leader we called Ash stood at the end of the bar watching the whiskey spread between the boot prints and chair legs, his face quiet the way it always was when he was adding things up, not numbers, but consequences, and he didn't ask the kid to repeat himself, didn't ask who was wired, didn't ask how he knew. He just looked at Rafe, and Rafe gave the smallest shrug like a man admitting the weather existed. And that was when Ash understood something had started earlier, before this room, before this night, maybe before the boy even found us. And the understanding showed only in the way he pressed his thumb against the edge of the counter until the skin went pale. The club didn't speak because silence is how loyalty looks when it's real, not dramatic. Just men glancing once at each other and then at the exits, checking reflections in bottles, listening past the music, and the kid stayed close to Rafe like he'd chosen his shadow already, which told me he knew who mattered. Runaways always know that fast. And someone near the door coughed into his fist and said, "You sure, kid?" And the kid nodded without looking at him and said, "I saw the bump when he leaned," and Rafe finally spoke, not loud, just steady, "Doesn't matter now," which was the wrong sentence if you didn't understand him and the right one if you did, because Rafe never said things to fix a moment. He said them after deciding the moment was already fixed. Ash stepped closer, boots slow, eyes on the floor, not the man the kid had pointed at with his chin, and he asked the boy, "Who told you what a wire looks like?" And the kid wiped his nose with his sleeve and said, "Nobody told me, I just seen." And that answer sat in the air like a coin still spinning, and I watched Ash hear something inside that the rest of us didn't yet hear. The faint echo of a door he himself had opened weeks ago when the kid first showed up outside the garage, asking for a place to sit where nobody would ask his name. And back then, Ash had said yes too quickly, which was rare for him. And I remember Torch whispering later, "You don't even know what he's running from." And Ash had said, "I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere else." And that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because every kindness is also permission for whatever follows it through the door. The man the kid meant was standing near the pool table, hands empty, posture loose, the kind of calm that either comes from innocence or training, and nobody rushed him, nobody grabbed him, because Ash hated being wrong more than he feared being hurt. That was the thing about him. Years ago, he'd broken a man's jaw for reaching into a jacket too fast, and found out after it was an inhaler. And since then, he measured twice, even when time said measure once. So he watched instead, and watching is slow pressure, and pressure makes truth sweat, and the man did sweat, just a line at his temple, but he didn't move for the door, didn't reach for a phone, didn't do anything useful for someone supposedly wired, which is when doubt started spreading through the room like smoke you can't see yet, but can taste. "Kid," someone said softly, "you point wrong, you own it." And the kid nodded again, quick, like he'd already accepted that rule before entering. And Ash asked him, "Why warn us?" And the boy answered, "Because they ain't after me." And that was the first moment the room shifted. Not loud, just a shared understanding sliding into place, because protection works like gravity in our line of work. Once you agree to it, you don't stop feeling its pull. And we had agreed, unofficial but real, that the boy was under our roof now, which meant whatever hunted him might look at us next. And Ash knew that. And I saw in his eyes the exact second he traced the line backward from the sticky whiskey on the floor to that earlier nod he'd given at the garage door, the small nod that said stay, the nod that cost nothing then. Rafe set the empty glass down and nudged it away from the spreading puddle with one finger and said, almost kindly, "If you're wrong, nobody here forgets." And the kid whispered, "I know." And the wired man finally spoke, voice calm but too careful. "You boys mind telling me what this is about?" And Nash looked at him for the first time and asked, "You mind telling me why you're sweating in winter?" And the man smiled a thin smile and said, "Heater's strong." And someone behind me muttered, "Heater's been dead since October." And the smile stayed, but the corners stiffened. And that's when Ash exhaled through his nose, not angry, just certain. And certainty is heavier than anger. It settles in the bones. Nobody touched the man yet. Nobody accused him. Because once you say a thing out loud, it becomes a road you can't unwalk. And Ash hated roads like that. So he turned slightly toward me, not taking his eyes off the stranger, and said, "Door." And I understood he meant close it, not guard it, just close it, which told me he wasn't afraid of someone getting out. He was afraid of someone listening in. And while I pushed the door shut, I saw his reflection in the dark glass. That same look he'd had years ago after the inhaler mistake. The look of a man replaying a choice he couldn't edit anymore. And I realized he wasn't thinking about the wired stranger or even the boy. He was thinking about the moment weeks back when he'd stepped aside and let a shivering kid cross the threshold. Because now whatever this was had followed that kid inside, quiet as breath. And Ash knew, the way leaders know when a math stops working, that the thing he'd allowed had already begun to unfold in there. Wasn't a word left he could say to send it back out the door. Pressure didn't show up like footsteps or engines or threats you could point at. It showed up the next morning in the form of small absences, and men like us notice absences faster than noise. Because noise can lie, but missing things usually tell the truth. And the first thing gone was the spare key from the nail by the office door. Not stolen in a hurry, just not there anymore, which made Brick frown at the wall longer than he needed to and say, "Who moved it?" in a voice that didn't accuse anyone yet. And nobody answered because nobody had. And Ash stood behind him with his arms folded, eyes on the empty nail like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. And it was the waiting that told us he was worried, not the silence, because Ash only waited when he was trying to see the shape of something he didn't want to name. The boy was at the back table with a plate he hadn't touched, put up even indoors, watching us the way strays watch kitchens, hopeful and ready to bolt at the same time. And Rafe leaned against the counter, rolling a toothpick between his fingers, gaze drifting from the kid to the door to the window like he was counting exits he already knew. And Torch came in from outside, wiping his hands on a rag, saying, "Mail's open." And we all looked at him because none of us had opened it yet. And he held up the envelope, slit clean across the top. No tear, no mess, just opened. And Ash asked, "You?" And Torch shook his head slow. And that was the second absence, not the letter itself, but the moment when it had been sealed. Nobody rushed to read it, which might sound strange to people who think trouble makes men frantic, but real pressure slows you down, makes you careful with your hands. And Ash finally took the envelope and tipped it until the paper slid out, one sheet, printed, official looking without saying official anywhere. And he read it once, then again, then folded it and handed it to me. And all it said was that a property adjacent to ours was scheduled for inspection regarding zoning compliance and any Cooperative businesses operating on shared access routes would be subject to review. No names, no accusations, just words that sounded polite enough to pass a desk, but carried the smell of somebody looking too closely. And Brick muttered, "We ain't cooperative with nobody." And Rafe said quietly, "Paper don't care," which was the kind of sentence he used when he wanted people to think instead of react. The boy spoke then, soft, that them, and nobody asked who he meant because we all understood he didn't mean inspectors. He meant the thing behind inspectors, the thing that doesn't knock, just rearranges. And Ash crouched a little so he wasn't towering over him and said, "You recognize the kind of move?" And the kid nodded once and said, "They start small so you feel dumb fighting it." And that sentence stayed in the room longer than any threat could have because it sounded practiced, like he'd lived inside that pattern before. And I saw three of the guys glance at Ash not for orders, but for reassurance, which he didn't give, not because he wouldn't, but because he couldn't yet. By noon, the phone rang twice with nobody speaking on the other end, just air and the faint click of someone deciding they'd heard enough. And by 2, a patrol car rolled slow past the lot without stopping, not unusual by itself, except it rolled past again 10 minutes later, same speed, same driver, eyes forward like he was pretending not to memorize what he'd already memorized. And Torch said, "They casing," and Brick said, "Let 'em look," but he said it too fast, which meant he didn't like it either. And Rafe flicked the toothpick into the trash and missed, which was the first time I'd seen his hands be anything but exact. Nobody mentioned the wired man from the night before, not out loud, but he was there in every pause because once you suspect a hook, you start feeling for the line. And Ash finally said, "Inventory," just that one word, and we all understood. Not weapons or cash, just count what matters: bikes, tools, papers, people. And we moved without talking, each of us checking our piece of the place, and nothing big was gone. Nothing you could point to and swear about. But things were off by inches, eh? Ledger turned the wrong direction. A drawer not fully closed. A rag missing from a hook. And those inches stacked up into a feeling you couldn't sweep out with a broom. The boy watched all of it, eyes moving like he was reading subtitles only he could see. And when Ash passed him, he asked, "You bring this?" Not harsh, just straight. And the kid swallowed and said, "I bring what was already chasing me," which wasn't an apology and wasn't a denial, just a fact shaped like both. And Ash nodded once because that was the answer he'd expected, the one that meant the choice he made weeks ago had reached its next step. Late afternoon, the power flickered. Not off, just a blink, but every man in that room looked up at the lights like farmers checking clouds. And when they steadied, Brick said, "That ain't coincidence." And Rafe replied, "Coincidence is just timing you don't understand yet." And Ash rubbed his jaw, thinking, weighing the old scar near his ear paling the way it did when his blood pressure rose. And I knew he was counting costs now. Not dollars, not bruises, but futures. And futures are the only currency he ever cared about. We argued then, quiet but sharp, not about fear, but about direction. Brick saying we should send the kid away before the pressure found a reason to turn into warrants. Torch saying that would prove we were scared. Rafe saying nothing for a long time until Ash asked him, "You got a thought?" And he answered, "Yeah," and stopped there, which made Brick snap, spit it. And Rafe shrugged slightly and said, "Pressure like this don't stop when you hand it what it wants. It stops when it decides it's done." And nobody liked that because it meant we weren't negotiating with a person. We were dealing with a decision already made somewhere else. The phone rang again then, and this time there was a voice, polite, wrong somehow, asking for our business name like he already knew it. And Ash took the receiver, listened, said no comment, and hung up gentle, not angry, just finished. And he stood there a long second with his hand still on the cradle before saying, "We pick." And we all knew what he meant, not pick a fight, pick a cost, because something was going to be taken from us whether we chose it or not. and choosing at least, let's say. Man looked himself in the mirror after. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then the kid said quietly, "If I go, they follow me instead." And Brick looked at him and asked, "You sure?" And the boy nodded, eyes steady now. And Rafe watched Ash, not the kid, just Ash, like he was waiting to see which piece of the leader would answer, the careful one or the tired one. And Ash finally said, "We don't hand people over simple, flat, final." And you could feel the decision land, heavy as a drop tool, because that sentence cost us our chance to be ignored. And we all knew it, every one of us, even before the patrol car rolled past again slower than before, like it had all the time in the world. The truth about Rafe didn't arrive like a confession or a reveal or any clean moment you could point to later. It came the way most truths do when they've been waiting their turn, sideways, attached to something else. And it started with a receipt none of us expected to matter. A thin paper slip that fell out of the ledger when Ash flipped it open on the workbench. The kind of receipt you get from a courthouse payment window, stamped, dated, already processed, and Ash stared at it longer than he ever stared at numbers, because it wasn't the money that caught him. It was the name printed above the amount, Rafe Calder, and the charge description underneath that said failure to appear, which didn't match the man we knew, because Rafe was exact about time, exact about promises, exact about showing up, and Ash didn't call attention to it right away. He just held the slip between two fingers like it might burn him if he grabbed it wrong. And he said quietly, "Rafe," and Rafe looked over from the doorway where he'd been watching the street. Not tense, not relaxed, just present. And he said, "Yeah." And Ash held up the receipt and asked, "You forget something." And the room shifted before Rafe even moved. Not because we thought he'd betrayed us, but because we all felt a piece of a pattern slide into place. The missing inches from yesterday lining up with the silence he'd been carrying for weeks. Rafe didn't rush to answer, which was his way. He stepped inside, wiped his boots slow on the mat though they weren't dirty, and said, "Where'd you find that?" And Ash replied, "Book," and handed it to him. And Rafe took it, looked at it once, then folded it neat and set on the table instead of pocketing it, which told Ash more than any excuse would have. And Brick said from behind me, "Court don't stamp paper for nothing." And nobody told him to shut up because he wasn't wrong. And the kid had. The back leaned forward like he already knew the ending, but wanted to hear how we'd say it. Ash asked, "You want to tell it or you want me guessing?" And Rafe rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table, eyes on the wood grain, and said, "Not much to tell," which was a lie shaped like a shield. And Ash nodded once like he'd expected that too, and said, "Then I'll guess." And he didn't sound angry, just careful, the way a man sounds when he's stepping onto ice he doesn't trust. "You missed a date you don't miss unless someone made sure you missed it." And Rafe's jaw tightened, just enough to see. And that was the first real answer. Nobody moved. Even the bikes outside sounded quieter. And Ash went on, voice steady. "And someone who can make you miss court can make you do other things too." And Rafe exhaled through his nose, not surrender, just tired agreement. And Brick muttered, "Hell," under his breath like he'd stubbed a toe on the truth. It still wasn't betrayal. Not yet, just shape, just outline. And Ash said, "What they got?" And Rafe finally looked up, eyes not guilty, not ashamed, just cornered. And he said something real. And those two words weighed more than any denial could have, because real means documented, stamped, filed, the kind of real that lives in cabinets and doesn't forget. And Torch asked quietly, "Bad real?" And Rafe nodded once. He didn't rush it, didn't dress it up. He just told it plain how 2 years back, before the kid ever knocked on our door, he'd been riding freight runs for a guy who said the cargo was clean. How one night it wasn't. How the stop turned into sirens and a searchlight and a bag in the saddle that wasn't his but had his prints now. how the charge never got pushed because someone higher up decided it was more useful hanging over him than locked in evidence, and how last month a man with a voice like an office hallway called and explained the arrangement slow and polite. Miss one court notice we send you, and the file wakes up, do small things when we ask, and the file keeps sleeping, nothing dramatic, just eyes open, ears open, pass along anything that sounds like trouble. And Rafe said he told them no the first time, and the second, and the third, until the envelope with the court date arrived, already stamped late, already impossible, already proof they could move time if they wanted. Nobody spoke when he finished because there wasn't a clean response to a story like that. No single word that covered it. And I watched the room change its mind about the last few days all at once. The missed toothpick toss, the extra looks at the door, the way he'd stood where he could see reflections, all of it rearranging itself from suspicious to obvious. And Brick scrubbed his face with both hands and said, "Why not say?" Not accusing, just worn out. And Rafe answered, "Because saying makes it yours too." And that landed harder than anything else he'd said. The kid's voice came soft from the back. "They do that." And Rafe glanced at him and gave a small nod like he respected the confirmation. And Ash hadn't taken his eyes off Rafe the whole time. Not judging, just measuring the weight of what this meant. And finally he asked, "You tell them anything yet?" And Rafe said, "No," and held his gaze, and Ash believed him. You could see it in the way his shoulders lowered half an inch. Not relief, just acceptance of a fact. Outside, a car passed slow, tires crunching gravel, and nobody looked because we all knew looking would mean something now. And Ash said, "They asked you to wear one," not a question, and Rafe shook his head, "Not yet," and added, "But they will." And the room understood that was the clock, not ticking loud, but ticking sure. Brick paced once, stopped, pointed at the door without meaning to, and said, "So what now?" And Ash didn't answer right away because this was the part he feared most, the choosing, the part where every road hurts somebody. And I could see that old memory behind his eyes again, the innocent man, the inhaler, the sound of bone against tile. And he spoke finally slow, like each word had a pass inspection before leaving. "Now we decide what we're willing to lose." And he looked at Rafe when he said it, not the kid, not the door, Rafe. And that was when I understood the decision had already started forming in him, heavy and certain and headed somewhere none of us would like. Rafe must have seen it too because he said, "You don't gotta carry me." And Ash replied, "Wasn't planning to," which sounded harsh until he added, "I'm planning to carry the choice." And that was different. That was leadership the way he did it. Not saving men, just owning outcomes. And he turned toward the back room, already moving, and said over his shoulder, "Get your jacket." And nobody asked who he meant because we all knew. And the kid whispered, "Where you going?" And Ash answered without stopping, to make sure the next knock lands where I can hear it, which didn't explain anything but told us enough. And as Rafe reached for his coat, I saw his hand shake once, quick, gone if you blinked, and I realized the strange behavior we'd watched for days hadn't been nerves or guilt or distance. It had been a man measuring every breath against a file with his name on it. And Ash knew that now, too. Knew it, and still chose to walk toward whatever waited outside. A choice I could already tell he'd regret later, even before the door opened and the cold came in. Afterward didn't feel like silence the way people expect. It felt like ordinary sounds continuing without asking permission. A truck downshifting on the highway, a bottle rolling somewhere it shouldn't be, the soft tick of the wall clock that nobody had noticed before all this started. And that was the first sign it was over, not because anything was fixed, but because nothing else was coming. No second wave, no shouted orders. Just the weight of what had already been chosen settling into the Room like dust you can't sweep because it isn't on the floor, it's in the air, and Ash stood near the table where the receipt still lay folded and didn't touch it again, not out of fear, just because it had already done its job. He'd gone out earlier with Rafe, no announcement, no plan spoken aloud, only that quiet instruction to get a jacket, and they'd come back the same way, walking not fast, not slow, and Rafe's hands were empty and Ash's face looked the way it does after a man signs something he can't unread, and nobody rushed them with questions because you learn in places like ours that answers arrive cleaner when they're not dragged out, and it was Rafe who spoke first, voice level, saying, "It's handled," which didn't sound like victory or relief, just a statement you could set down and step away from. Brick asked, "Handled how?" And Rafe shrugged once and said, "They won't be asking me for anything anymore." And that sentence hung there, heavy with the shape of whatever it didn't describe. And Torch said, "Careful, that don't sound free." And Rafe gave a small shake of his head like he appreciated the accuracy. And Ash moved past them toward the counter and finally said, "It isn't." And that was all he added, because explanations make things smaller, and this wasn't small. The kid watched from his chair, eyes moving between them like he was tracking a ball nobody else could see. And he asked, "They done with all of you too?" And Ash leaned his palms on the counter and said, "No," plain as wood, and the boy nodded like he'd expected that answer more than any other. Nobody asked what Ash had traded because you could see it if you knew him, see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he kept flexing his right hand like he'd shaken on something that still stung. And I remembered what he'd said before leaving about carrying the choice. And I understood now he hadn't meant choosing for Rafe. He meant choosing what part of the club would be left alone and what part wouldn't. The kind of math you can't write down because it uses people instead of numbers. Brick lit a cigarette he didn't really want and said, "So what changes?" And Ash answered, "Nothing you can fix with a wrench." And that was the closest he came to telling us that some doors had been quietly closed somewhere far from this room. Doors we'd never see, but would feel every time we tried to push where we used to walk through. Rafe leaned against the wall. Not hiding, not center stage, just there, and the strange tightness he'd carried for weeks was gone now, replaced by something steadier and heavier, like a man who'd set down a bag only to realize it had been holding him upright. And he said after a minute, "I'm out," and nobody pretended not to understand. He didn't mean for the night. He meant from the patch, the table, the name on the wall. And Torch looked at Ash quick, not asking permission, just checking if this was the cost that had been paid. And Ash didn't nod or shake his head. He just said, "Your call," which is how you let a man keep his spine when he's walking away. The kid whispered, "You don't gotta," but Rafe gave him a faint smile and said, "Yeah, I do." And it wasn't guilt in his voice, it was balance, like he was putting something back where it belonged. And he pushed off the wall and crossed the room, slow, letting each step exist. And when he reached the door, he paused, not dramatic, just long enough to look once at Ash. And Ash met his eyes and said, "You ever need," and didn't finish. And Rafe nodded like he'd heard the rest anyway. Then he opened the door and went out into the kind of night that doesn't look different no matter what a man's leaving behind. The latch clicked, soft, final, and nobody spoke for a while because that sound had taken something with it. Not just a member, but a version of the place, the version where we still believe pressure was something you could outweigh if you were stubborn enough. Brick crushed his cigarette out half-smoked and muttered, "Damn," which wasn't anger or sadness, just the noise a man makes when a fact settles in his chest. And Torch rubbed the back of his neck and said, "So they got what they wanted." And Ash shook his head once and replied, "No." And when Torch asked, "Then what did they get?" Ash said, "A line," and didn't explain further, but we all felt it. The invisible border drawn somewhere beyond our walls. The one you don't see until you lean on it. And feel it lean back. The boy slid off his chair and came closer, cautious like always, and asked, "They still coming for me?" And Ash looked at him a long second before answering. And when he did, his voice was quieter than before, not weak, just honest. "Maybe." And the kid nodded, taking that in the way people do when they've learned maybes are the only promises that don't lie. Outside, a siren passed far off. Not for us. Not tonight. And the clock kept ticking like it had decided time was none of our business. And I watched Ash straighten, roll his shoulders once, and reach over to fold the receipt again, even though it was already folded. And I realized that was it. That was the aftermath, not cheers or sirens or endings. Just men standing in the same room with one chair empty and one future missing and one truth understood too late, that the smallest yes can start a road you can't see until you're already miles down it. And if there was any lesson in what happened, it wasn't about wires or files or who was hunting who. It was this: the quiet choices are the ones that last. And once they begin, they don't care whether you're ready for where they lead.